What's up, YouTube? Hope you're all having an awesome afternoon. I'm about to attempt to break down all of my thoughts and findings, considerations, all of my testing results leading up to RC Charlotte. So if you're still looking for a little idea for that last couple deck spots, hopefully this video will help you out. I really want to break down Esper versus Dimir, Oculus versus non-Oculus, talk about the expected meta, and give you an overview of effectively every card that I tested. So we'll be going down through the list, kind of breaking down hand disruption spells, removal spells, cantrips, counterspells, threats, sideboard options, lands, the whole 9 yards, to give you the complete breakdown of what I have found through my play. So if that's something that's going to interest you, stick around, stay tuned. Hopefully you learned something from the video, and don't forget to consider subscribing to the YouTube channel, leave a comment about what kind of stuff you found, and hopefully we can put some frogs in top 8, and who knows, maybe take down Charlotte. All right, gonna try to record this on the headset mic, a little bit of outside noise, so hopefully we can drown that out. So the first two big questions I really want to tackle are Esper versus Dimir and Oculus versus non-Oculus. So I started off the testing process on Dimir Oculus with a Abhorrent Oculus Unearth, all those shenanigans. And the two biggest issues I was finding was, one, the consistency. Like, the highs felt really good when you're able to Thought Scour over a threat and unearth, or find that early Psychic Frog, discard an Oculus, unearth it. Feels really good. The problem is when that doesn't play out, you lack the ability to be a good, efficient, effective mid-range deck, because you have to cut some amount of interaction for things like unearth. Got to play a worse cantrip in Thought Scour or Picklock Prankster, and I just wasn't able to grind out wins against decks that were determined to not lose to the unearth plan. So Oculus, as much as I do really appreciate and enjoy the card, I think has run into a little bit of a wall at the moment with the massive amount of main deck grave hate going around with all the Ketramos decks. And if you're trying to be a fair mid-range hard cast your threats deck, then just traditional Murktide Regent is often the better threat to be hard casting, because not only can it get bigger than an Oculus, it dodges things like Dismember that's running around a lot right now because of Ketramos, dodges Fatal Push, dodges things like Prismatic Ending. So it's able to stay on the battlefield with a little bit more resilience than Oculus would. And the fact that you can grow it over time means those early turns where your opponent might not be nuking your graveyard yet, and you can just play out a 4/4, 5/5 Murktide, is great for your ability to top deck a second Murktide or a Psychic Frog later and get that Murktide up to a proper 8/8, 9/9, whatever the case may be. So that was my conclusion for Oculus versus non-Oculus. For Esper versus Dimir, we did play a lot of Ketramos when Ketramos dropped, both in the Oculus shell and in the traditional Murktide shell. What I found in the Oculus shell was I was having a lot of trouble getting Ketramos online. Like, I might resolve a Ketramos or unearth a Ketramos and get a trigger to, but I was having a really difficult time getting these 7 cards in exile unless I was just playing Murktide. But at that point, I was finding that Murktide was just the better threat. Like, Ketramos would draw me a bunch of cards, and I think that the combination of Ketramos and Psychic Frog is phenomenal. But if you didn't see the Psychic Frog, Ketramos was pretty underwhelming. And if you saw Ketramos and Murktide just outshined. Because, like, yeah, I'd have a few extra cards in hand off the Ketramos, but Murktide would be the thing that's actually getting the game over with And I found a lot of the times I didn't need those extra cards if I just had the Murktide. In the traditional builds, I think Ketchermos had a little more of a positive result for me. I think playing that control style game and then dropping down to Ketchermos in like turn 5, 6, 7, following it up with a Frog or a Murktide would a lot of times allow you to close out the games very quickly. We had a lot of really good combo turns where our opponent was at 15, 16 life. We had a Ketchermos, we had a Psychic Frog, and we got to sit here and draw, discard, and eventually find a path to lethal with a giant frog in the air plus our new god friend. But ultimately, the white splash making me a worse Harbinger of the Seas deck was a big part of the decision there to finally stick with Dimir. I think that Harbinger being a lights out card against Amulet, giving you plenty of free wins against decks like Eldrazi where you cut off their colorless mana, or against some of the greedy mana bases out there, makes me really not want to register a deck that can't take full advantage of Harbinger if I'm already primarily blue. And I know some people are going to be registering Ketchermos, like Esper Ketchermos with Harbinger, and are under the impression that they're just as good at taking advantage of Harbinger as Dimir is. Like, oh, Harbinger doesn't hurt me that bad. But not bad is a non-zero amount. And although Dimir can run into the issue of not having the basic swamp when Harbinger resolves, you have enough of a blue density, especially with the inclusion of cards like Subtlety, Heavy Force Negation, Heavy Sink into Stupor, that you can play a very good mono blue control game through Harbingering both players out of the game, where I think Unearth especially, but any of the Ketchermos builds with like Prismatic Ending, Pest Control, Ketchermos itself, are just going to have a much more difficult time pulling that off. So that's my thoughts on Esper versus Dimir. I think these new kind of brands of Dimir builds with Subtlety, Consider are a really, really good way to attack what's currently going on. Subtlety gives you a great ability to fight over things like opposing Overlords, Ketchermoses, any aggressive start, Scion of Dracos, Kavus, whatever. Even turn 1 Ocelot Prides, Ragavans occasionally. Sink into Stupor lets you answer some of those resolve things that squeak through the cracks. And being able to hold up like Orcish Bowmaster when you're not counterspelling, as well as being really good into both Boros and opposing Ketchermos decks. Just really makes this flash plan feel like it's got more weight than it probably realistically should. But I don't think that Charlotte has had enough time to adapt to this kind of build yet. So I'm hoping to kind of utilize that to take advantage of some wins against some people still gearing heavily for Breach, Boros, Black, White, and not respecting our Merc fathers. So now that we've given a breakdown of that, let's get into some of the individual testing results for all the different card groups. All right, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the video here. So what you see on screen is all the stuff that I played at some point or another in a traditional Dimir shell, Dimir FrogTide. And I want to go through everything. We'll just like start over on the far left for the lands, talk about the mana base, its functions for me, and move over. And I'll talk about every column as we get to it. I guess that's probably the best way to do it. So starting off with the mana, for me personally, I've found that 21 mana sources covered everything I want. And that was 18 lands with 3 copies of Sink into Stupor, our blue MDFC. When I was running 20 mana sources, I was finding too many times where I had a 1-lander and had to try to cantrip for the second, or worse, had a 1-lander with a fetch land, had to decide between fetching up a surveil land, fetching and like shocking a watery grave on turn 1 to cast a cantrip. What if I had to interact with what my opponent was doing? And that wasn't working out for me. 21 has felt like I have more games where I naturally have a second land in hand, which is perfect. That way I can interact on 1 without worrying about missing my second land drop. I can save my cantrips for like turn 3 to be able to cantrip, find a land if I need one, have 2 mana still up to counterspell, or have a frog on 2 with 2 mana, then like untap with counterspell mana on 3 without having to not interact in that first turn. I think the turn 1 interaction is so crucial to the deck that having to spend it on cantripping or getting a surveil land just sets you too far behind. And I know that's crazy to think about, that we're in a format where not doing something on turn 1 and you're too far behind. But in a world with Tamios and Emrys or Mox Opals, Amulet of Vigors, Ragavan, Ocelot, Pride, there's just so much going on early that you have to be able to do something to progress your game plan, whether it's fighting over something else, digging for what you're looking for. Just have to do something. You can't afford to spend your first turn just looking for a second land. So that's where the 21 mana sources came from. The breakdown of that mana that's worked best for me has been 2 Undercity Sewers, 2 Watery Graves, could be the third if you want to go up on fetchables. I don't think that's a big deal. 2 islands and a swamp. I hate the swamp with a passion. I absolutely despise the basic swamp with every fiber of my being. It has lost me so many games, but it is a necessary evil if you're playing Harbinger. I know other people play Murktide and hate it just as much as I do. I wish there were a way around it. If you want to build your mana base and just say, I'm going to run Harbinger, and if I don't have the swamp, so be it. I applaud you. I don't think it's realistic, but have at it. 9 or 10 fetches has been the sweet spot for me. The 4 polluted deltas are mandatory. Then I just like to follow it up with 4 blue fetches and 2 black fetches. That way I've got 6 fetches for the basic swamp for Harbinger games. I've got this full 10 fetches to be able to get Undercities whenever I want them, or just pick up a Water Grave, pick up my basics aggressively if I want. Just really easy to fix the mana and get your surveil lands when you want them. The last couple land spots have been flexed around a little bit. Dark Slick Shores, I really like if I'm on Thoughtseize. Having that turn 1 painless untapped black mana is really, really nice. Gloomlake Verge, I've been less and less impressed by, especially as we've been moving towards like these higher Sink into Stupor counts. I've had too many games with a Gloomlake Verge with like second Gloomlake Verge and a Sink into Stupor, and I can't make black mana. Or Gloomlake, Dark Slick, Sink, and I need double black, but can't. So I'm pretty well off of Gloomlake. Otawara, you're on such a low land count anyway that you're very, very rarely ever cycling Otawara or channeling Otawara. It can come up, but I found that the vast majority of the times I was just using Otawara because I needed that second land. And if I'm going to play a land as a land, I don't want more non-black sources in my double island, triple sink into stupor, possibly Gloom Lake Verge deck. So I ended up swapping out the Otawara for another fetch just to make the mana a little bit more consistent. Plus having fetches to fill up your graveyard for Murktide, for Flying Frogs, really big deal. So I think if you have the choice, go up on fetches before you go up on too many of the less versatile, like Dark Slick Shore, Gloom Lake Verge style lands. Anything else about the mana base? I guess just some general tips. Like Undercity Sewers, obviously nice early, but don't feel like you're in a rush to get your Undercity Sewers. I think I see a lot of people kind of take off turn one just to plan on fetching and surveilling. And I don't think that's where you want to be. You want to be interacting or doing something proactive on turn one, and then have your surveil lands in like the mid game to help dig for specific things. Game or turn one, you often don't know what you're looking for. Maybe you need a threat and you have a little bit more information, but a lot of times you have an opening hand with like a counterspell, a frog, an Inquisition or something, a couple lands. And if you surveil and start flipping over stuff on turn one, you don't know how the game's playing out yet. So you just kind of used up that resource for not a lot of benefit because, yeah, you just don't have an idea of what exactly you're looking for yet. So try to be a little more patient on your surveil lands if you can afford to. So on to the hand disruption. I got on the board Thoughtseize, Inquisition, Dreams of Steel and Oil. I think that Thoughtseize is by far and away the best option, and I don't even think it's particularly close. Inquisition missing things like Solitude, Overlord of the Baelmerk, Showdown of the Scalds, Leyline Binding, Scion of Draco, opposing Subtleties or Murktides, Primeval Titans, Lumras. Like, you kind of get the idea. It adds up really quickly what Inquisition misses. Dreams of Steel and Oil falls into that same kind of category to me. Missing things like Leyline Binding is a really big deal. Static Prisons, Goblin Bombardments. What else am I thinking? Tribal Flames, Flame of Anor, Unholy Heat, Underworld Breach. Just, I think that Inquisition and Dreams combined have such a big gap in things that they're able to cover that I don't think it's worth playing the first copy of either of those over any of the first four copies of Thoughtseize. I get that the pain of thought seizing, the 2 life loss is very relevant to a lot of players. But at the end of the day, I would rather lose that 2 life to get rid of the thing I want to get rid of than risk not being able to interact with it. Dreams especially has fallen off with less Murktide decks running around, so less exiling an Oculus from the yard, taking a Murktide from hand or something like that. It does have a little bit more usefulness if you're playing a Ketchermos build and you're able to draw a card off exiling a creature or artifact from the yard, but I would still not run Dreams over some number of Thoughtseize. Ultimately, I think that the Thoughtseize slot is probably necessary in the 75 somewhere. There's a pretty good chance I'm going to run 2 or 3 in the main deck going into Charlotte. I just think that the information you gained is very, very critical. Not game defining, but being able to formulate a game plan around known information is a really big deal. I think there's a lot of combo decks in the format right now with stuff like Breach and Amulet, Goryo's, Storm. So Thoughtseize being a proactive answer into a lot of that stuff is a very big deal. So yeah, probably 2, 3, maybe even 4 copies of Thoughtseize. I do not have a defined 75 yet. That's what I'm finalizing today and tomorrow. But it will include some amount of Thoughtseize in the 75 and 0 copies of either Inquisition or Dreams of Steel and Oil. I can tell you that for sure. Okay, on to the cantrips here. So Consider has been like the hotness at the moment, being able, again, to play that more flash gameplay with Consider, Counterspell, Bowmasters, Subtlety, Sink into Stupor. I will 100% agree with anybody that says Consider is worse than Preordain. Preordain is the better cantrip, but Consider being able to be held up or not have to spend mana on your own main phase is a very big deal when you're trying to interact on your opponent's turn. Now, I will say there's a bit of a wavelength effect here where if you have even mana, Consider is better because you're repping Counterspell, you're repping Bowmasters, and if you don't have one of those, Considering is a nice touch. On the odd mana cost, Preordain gets better because now you have 1 mana to Preordain, 2 mana, 4 mana left over to hold up your Counterspell, your Subtlety, whatever. And then back to even mana, Consider gets better. And it definitely has a bit of a wavelength function. But you kind of have to take into account which you want to see more often, and more often you want to be holding up all your mana for counters. So Consider probably gets the nod for me just because it plays very well with the rest of the deck. And I don't think it's such a large gap between Consider and Preordain that you really need to be overly concerned that you're losing a lot of win rate for one or the other. I don't blame you if you want to run Preordain over. A lot of lists I run, I'm on like 4 Consider plus 2 or 3 Preordain. I don't know if I'll keep that going into Charlotte. I'll probably just stick with 1 and run 4 of it, but we'll see. I'll definitely be posting my full list in the Discord before deck submission time. Dress Down. I only played a couple leagues with Dress Down. I will admit it was better than I thought it was going to be. I don't know if it's the long-term answer that I would want. It's great into construct tokens, obviously. Good into ETB abilities out of things like Black White or out of Amulet Titan. I have lost a lot of game ones recently because of my opponent having 2 or 3 Urza sagas. So having Dress Down in the main to stop something like that could have maybe swung those games. I don't think it plays very well with Subtlety, Psychic Frog, Bowmaster, Murktide is like the core of your threat base. But if you're really interested in playing the more control role and not jamming out your threats early, then Dress Down can be a great option to bridge you over. Sauron's Ransom and Stock Up. Pretty much any of like the 3 mana cantrips I actively hate. I think that the sorcery speed on Stock Up makes it almost unplayable because you're really banking on, okay, I've got to find free interaction off this. I have to find Subtlety, Force Negation, or I risk just dying against decks like Breach, Amulet, Boros, Goryo's Storm. Like, I can't afford to tap out on turn 3 to play this cantrip. And if I'm not able to cast it, why is it in my deck? I ran into the issue with Stock Up multiple times where I think I played against Hollow One. And if I cast the Stock Up, I was dead. And then another game, I only had 2 lands and couldn't cast the Stock Up, even if I wanted to. So having a large quantity of cards in your deck that you physically cannot cast in some situations when you want to be able to function on 2 lands is a pretty big detriment to the card. Sauron's Ransom, I think, is less versatile than Archmage's Charm. Like, I get when people say, oh, you get 2 cards off the top, the best 2 out of the top 4. First off, I hate that argument because if you take the 2 that are face up, then it's just as if you took 2 random cards off the top of your deck with Archmage's Charm. And if you take the 2 that's face down, again, it's just as if you took the 2 random ones off Archmage's Charm. There's tiny little percentage point games you can play by saying, oh, if I've got a Dothy face up and I don't want a Dothy, then taking the face down pile means there's slightly lower percentage of another Dothy being in there. I really don't think those percentage points are worth playing the suboptimal cantrip. I think Sauron's Ransom, Stock Up, stuff like that are the cards that you want when it's turn 10 and both sides are top decking and there's an empty board and you hit one of those. But more often than not, that's not the scenario that you have the card. The scenario you have the card is it's in your opening hand and you have to interact or you risk dying against a lot of the format's top decks. And instead of having another piece of interaction, you've got a Sauron's Ransom. And that's where you're stuck, or you got to stock up, and that doesn't do anything to help you continue the game. Finally, Cling to Dust. I really, really like Cling to Dust. I would like to find room for it in my final list if I can. I think it's way better with cards like Tamiyo. So if you're on Tamiyo, considering Cling to Dust could be a nice little touch for you. If you're not on Tamiyo, I do think the card is still very solid. I have had people point out like, oh, we're in a Relic of Progenitus meta. Cling to Dust really awkward against Relic. And to an extent, I agree. But I think the versatility of being able to target like Emery targets or hit Flages, take your opponent off Delirium, give yourself a way to repeatedly draw cards when you got a full yard, got some mana, nothing to do, which happens every now and then. I think all those kind of add up. A little bit extra life gain. Seen a lot of burn recently. Having a little extra life gain is not the worst idea in the world. So Cling to Dust, I do think, has a very high upside amount of versatility, pretty low cost. So I would at least take a look at it if you're looking for an extra spot and you want it to be a cantrip. The counters. So I put Sink into Stupor in the counters. Obviously, kind of a hybrid between a land and an unsubstantiate. I think that Sink has a lot of versatility. There are not many times where I'm sinking something that's already hit the battlefield. I think more often than that, or more often than not, that's a pretty suboptimal play because there's so many like good ETB abilities in Modern at the moment. I really don't want to give my opponent that same ETB ability again. So more often than not, I'm trying to sink into Stupor things like a Flage return from the graveyard or an opposing Murktide or Oculus, something like that. Or if I've got an opportunity to hit in with a frog and then just sink to get another draw, sink like whatever you play, untap, hit you with the frog again, get another draw off the frog, gain card advantage that way, then I'll use Sink pretty aggressively in those situations. But being able to play it out as land is obviously very, very big upside. Force Negation, I think, is kind of the unsung backbone of the deck. Counterspell answers the vast majority of problems you have to deal with, but Force Negation does a phenomenal job at stopping the broken stuff early. So stopping like the turn 1 Amulet of Vigor, stopping the turn 1 Aether Vial or Relic of Progenitus, fighting over the Goblin Bombardment or the Static Prison when you tap out for Frog, hitting random things like Birthing Ritual when you tap out or you're on the draw and you don't have Counterspell up yet. I think Force could easily be a 4 of if you want it to be. I really liked the 3 count. I kind of want to see, the first Force the vast majority of the time. Second Force a little bit less so. And I definitely don't want to see 3 of them, so that's why I'm a little hesitant to go up to 4. Typically, rule of thumb is like 4 of is you want this card in your opening hand every single game. You want to see multiples if possible. 3 is like, I want to see the first one. The second one can do with, could do without. Definitely don't want to see the 3, and I think that's where Force falls for me. Spell Snare has been getting a lot worse in my mind recently. I know that it should be really good into Underworld Breach, but what I'm finding is more games where my opponent's got turn 1 Imri or Tameo, and then it's just a slew of 1 mana interactions. So Spell Pierce, Swan Song, what was it, Strict Serenade, Flame of Venor, Unholy Heat, like all these 1 mana, 3 mana things that Snare just isn't interacting with. And then finally, way down the road, they might go for a breach, you snare it, they have second breach, and you're just kind of left in the dust. Against Boros, a lot of the same things. You're missing all the static prisons. You get to hit the Ajani and the Goblin Bombardment, but then if your opponent just follows it up with Ranger Captain, Spyro, Flage, Showdown of the Scalds, then that snare is looking a little underwhelming. So it's kind of a necessary evil at the moment, almost like the basic swamp, but it has definitely not been as good for me in recent testing as it was before I really started the heavy Charlotte testing. Counterspell, still like, unlike Force Negation, it's the sung hero of the deck. Counterspell is just your ability to say no to any problematic thing in just about any problematic situation. Not seeing a lot of like Cavern of Souls running around, even out of Eldrazi and Amulet, so that's a big plus. 2 mana to deal with like an escaped Flage, being able to hit Scion of Draco if you're on the play. Opposing Murktides, hitting Overlords if you're on the play. Solitudes. Yeah. It's just, it's your catch-all. It's your stabilizer. It's your ability to close out games. I wouldn't register less than 4. Archmage's Charm. Like Sauron's Ransom and stock up. I got it in the Counterspell list. It could be in the draw list if you really wanted it to be, but I find myself countering more than I draw. As far as Counterspells go, it's pretty bad being 3 mana instead of 2, but the flexibility of being able to draw comes up a good bit. Every now and then you steal a 1-drop, but what I was finding was in the matches I was playing Archmage's Charm, if I did steal a 1-drop, it wasn't changing the game much. Like I stole a really big Mako against Hollow One, and my opponent just had like another Mako and 2 Vengevines and just swung around it. And it was like, okay, whatever. So outside of those situations, I don't think there's a lot of times that you want to be stealing something. You could try to steal a Tameo if Breach nowadays against you is really aggressive about trying to flip Tameo early. Don't have a lot of great ways to deal with it. So Archmage's Charm, steal a Tameo when they're getting ready to ult could be pretty fun, but it's just not like a consistent game plan that I'm looking for. So I don't want to play Archmage's Charm with the sole expectation of let me steal a flip Tameo. Spell Pierce. If Boros was still like top tier, I'd be higher on Spell Pierce, but since it's falling off, Breach gets ahead of you with Moxes really early, really aggressively, so they can often pay for Spell Pierce very easily. And I don't think there's a lot of other like non-creature combo decks that Pierce is doing a good enough job against. So not really interested in running Pierce. To the removal, Fatal Push. Hits like 75% of what you care about. So Revolt is definitely the biggest drawback for Fatal Push. Another reason to want all those fetch lands in the mana base is being able to Revolt Fatal Push. But with Ragavan, Ocelot Pride, Guide of Souls, Imri, Tameo, Frogs, it's very difficult to justify running less than 4 Fatal Push. I think that you have to have that turn 1 interaction in too many matchups, and nothing else is doing the same job that Fatal Push is. So if you find a replacement, I would love to hear it. I have not found one yet. Dismember. This one gets a lot of questions in Discord, on stream, everywhere else. Why Dismember? Why 2 Dismember? Like, what? Why not Shoot the Sheriff? Why not Bitter Triumph or Bitter? What's the other one? I don't know. One of those 2 mana removal spells. And it's a very, very specific reason. Dismember kills everything out of black-white, and it kills Imri and Tameo for 1 mana. That's it. If you are trying to justify like, oh, it doesn't kill Flage, I don't care that it doesn't kill Flage. I want the spot to kill Imri and Tameo for 1 mana and everything out of black-white. And Dismember is the only card that does that. There's plenty of like 2 mana answers, but that doesn't fulfill the first requirement of Tameo and Imri on turn 1. There's plenty of 1 mana removal spells that kill most everything out of black, white, but like misses Ketchermos. Doesn't fill that role. Dismember kills everything out of black, white, including Balemerk. So that's the reasoning for the 2 Dismember. I will say I have been running into more Flages recently with Zoo and Boros, at least in the challenges. So I did try out a first Shoot the Sheriff over the 2nd Dismember and hated the 2 mana side of it. I think I would rather just hedge on the Dismember being more relevant into the stuff I want to deal with and figure out a way to get Revolt against Flage. But I do think that the life loss is non-zero if you're running Dismember and Thoughtseize. Hopefully Boros is on enough of a decline that doesn't come back and bite me this weekend. But I will probably be registering 4 Fatal Push, 2 Dismember as my removal suite. Cut Down kills Imri and Tameo on 1, kills like Ragavan, Ocelot Pride, Guide of Souls, Ajani, kills Felia, Emperor of Bones, Solitude, doesn't kill Overlord, doesn't kill Ketchermos, which is like the 2 big ones that it misses. Also doesn't kill opposing Frogs. So I don't mind Cut Down if you're expecting like Boros, Breach, Black, White. Just know that you still need to find answers to Ketchermos and Overlord, which hopefully you're counterspelling those, but sometimes it doesn't line up. So I like having Dismember to answer something after it's resolved instead of Cut Down that forces you to have the counter at the right time. I will also say that like Dress Down helping Fatal Push answer Ketchermos is a thing. So if you don't want to run Dismember or Cut Down and you are thinking about Dress Down, you can be a little more lenient with your removal suite. Shoot the Sheriff, Bitter Triumph, Shieldred's Edict, Long Goodbye. All of our 2 mana removal spots. Shoot the Sheriff, I think, misses the fewest amount of cards with the lowest amount of downside, or lowest amount of downside. Mrs. Ragavan and Dolthy is like the only relevant cards. Occasionally something else will show up, but those are the only ones that like really, really matter. Ragavan being the main one, but if you're on like 4 copies of Orcish Bowmaster, Ragavan's a lot less impactful. not having to pay life for something like Bitter Triumph or discard a card is a big deal in a lot of the attrition matchups. With Bitter Triumph, just bring that one up. For a while there was an additional way to discard Oculus if you're wanting it, but if you're not running Oculus, then you want the option that doesn't require you to pay life or go down on cards, which again is Shoot the Sheriff. Shieldred's Edict is an idea in here because it does answer it answers Ketramos, answers opposing Scion or Dracos, even if they have a ley line out, can kill pretty much any other threat you're concerned about, gets around stuff like Ephemerate, but it doesn't kill Imri or Tamiyo on turn 1. And again, like I've said numerous times in this video, not interacting on turn 1 can be a death sentence a lot of the time. So making sure that your interaction can get through early and often is a very big deal. And taking turn 2 off to play a removal spell instead of playing a frog or a bowmaster or something is a non-zero cost. Long Goodbye. I really like Long Goodbye. I think the card in general is really, really, really strong, but it kind of fell out of favor when we stopped seeing as many frog Oculus mirrors. I think Long Goodbye is an S tier interactive spell into opposing psychic frogs and important Oculuses, but if those aren't prevalent, I want to be able to answer Tamiyo or Imri for cheaper. And if I don't use it for Tamiyo or Imri, then there's a good chance it's missing a decent chunk of the format. Like not hitting Solitude, Ketramos, Overlord, to a lesser extent, Primeval Titans, Murktides. But usually you got to counter those. If you don't counter them, you're dead. That's about it for the removals. Let's get on to the threats. This one's kind of a chunky list of cards to go over. So Murktide, your primary way of getting games over with. Large, flying, evasive threat, kind of covers everything you want. If you're able to land a Murktide, is like a 6/6, 7/7, 8/8 with force negation or counterspell backup. It's a pretty close to the locked up win for you. The downside is Murktide plus Basic Swamp is the biggest nombo in the deck because you're wanting to play out Murktide, hold up double blue for Counterspell, and Swamp makes it so that you have to hit a lot of lands to make that happen. So sometimes you end up delaying playing Murktide for a turn to try to wait to get basic or like that 5th land. That's come back to bite me several times. There have been plenty of games where I just needed to jam the Murktide on like turn 4 with the Basic Swamp, not hold up Counterspell, and try to get the game over with. You gotta either use Thoughtseize to inform the decision or hope you have Force Negation, Subtlety, whatever. But I think more often than not, we're in a meta where you just got to jam and pray, because if you miss that land drop another turn, then you're probably too far behind, just giving your opponent 2 turns for free interaction. So be careful with your fetches early. There's a lot of games that you could get Basic Swamp and save a couple life. It's probably better to just go ahead and get a Watery Grave to make sure you can maximize Murktide plus counter magic. Bowmasters. Bowmasters is this really funky card where it's either phenomenal or atrocious and like nowhere in between. When you've got a Bowmasters that's pinging off a Cat and Ocelot Pride and blocking a Ragavan, you're like, oh, this card is the best thing ever. I just spent half of a Bowmasters to answer 2 threats on their side. Or we had a game against Neo Brand where our opponent got a Gristlebrand, activated it, we responded with Bowmasters, and they scooped. They couldn't win anymore. Bowmasters is really, really good into like blue-white control, Jeskai control with all their Null Drifters and such. It's really good into opposing frog decks, opposing Murktide decks. It's really, really bad into stuff like Amulet Titan and Storm and what else? Zoo, Mill, Belcher. Pretty bad into Grinding Station. So Bowmasters is like just mind-numbingly frustrating because I want to cut it, but I've thought of so many games that it's won me. I don't think I can afford to cut it. It also pairs extraordinarily well with Kaito, Bane of Nightmares, which we'll get to that one in a minute. But it really emphasizes this desire to go more instant speed. Being able to hold up counterspell, your opponent doesn't do anything, you want to counter, flash into Bowmasters is really, really nice. If I weren't running Bowmasters, I'd probably be looking at like the dress downs in that slot, maybe a couple stern scoldings in that slot, something like that to try to bridge the gap. But Bowmasters absolutely has an effect on the game that not a lot of cards do, so don't cut it lightly. Psychic Frog, best threat in the deck from a versatility standpoint. Card advantage, evasion, ability to dodge like red base removal, all wrapped into one. I know Mengucci used to say in his videos that like any hand that had frog and lands you keep. It's pretty accurate, especially on the play. Just jamming a frog, really forcing the issue, forcing your opponent to have the right interaction right then and there is a big deal. Be more aggressive with your frog discards. Like, the games I lose with frogs are the ones that I try to poke over and over again, like discard one, hit for two, discard another, hit for three, and just gave my opponent like 5 extra turns for no reason. Especially if you're in an open deck list event like Charlotte and you can land a frog and see, okay, well, my opponent's got these things I need to worry about. I've got double counterspell in hand. I'm throwing away these 2 lands, Thoughtseize, or land Thoughtseize, subtlety, whatever, because they're not what I need right now. And I'm just getting the game over with in frog in like 3 turns. It'll save you a lot of headaches down the road. In a closed deck list event, I get being more conservative, but we're not planning for a closed deck list event. So take a look at what you need, what you don't need, discard aggressively to frog. Subtlety. I've made the comment on stream a few times that I think when subtlety has been at its best has been as a 4 mana flash 3/3 with no other text. 4 mana flash to flying 3/3 with no other text. And I still think that's the case more often than not. It does have some good moments where you're able to like jam a frog and subtlety an opposing frog, or subtlety and a Johnny or something when your opponent taps out. It's a blue card to pitch to force, which I know isn't that big of an argument, but it's non-zero. It's got a very cool synergy with force, where if you have both of them in your hand and your opponent casts a non-creature, you can force stitch subtlety, cast a creature, subtlety, pitch force. And so that versatility of getting to cover everything for free is pretty cool. I really don't find myself subtletying aggressively, like 1 or 2 mana or turn 1 or 2 subtletying, unless it's something I just can't deal with on the draw. So like an Overlord on the draw, Solitude on a frog on the draw. What else? Scion of Draco on the draw. Like, those kind of situations, it's really, really nice to have subtlety. But against things like Grinding Station, I'm not subtletying a turn 1 Tamiyo or Emery unless I just have nothing going on. So subtlety really good into Orzhov, into Amulet, opposing Murktide, Ketchermost builds, Zoo, kind of mediocre against everything else, but it still is a 4 mana flash 3/3 flyer in a deck that's wanting to hold up mana. So take it with a grain of salt. Graveyard Trespasser. I do really like Graveyard Trespasser. I think that it's got a lot of versatility, whether it be hitting some stuff out of the grave against Grinding Station, hitting Flages against Boros, hitting Solitudes and whatnot out of the grave against Orzhov so they can't be Bale Merked back. Hitting opposing Oculus or Frogs out of the Unearthed decks. I do think it's slow. I think it's better in the Oculus shells than the non-Oculus shells because being able to unearth it or potentially flip it over with an Oculus and flip it over into turn is a much better deal than just hard casting it for 3. But if you're looking for an additional threat behind Murktide, Bowmaster, Frog, Subtlety, and you're not wanting to run Tamiyo, I think Graveyard Trespasser is the next best option. So if you're looking for threat density and a pretty good interactive value threat, Graveyard Trespasser is definitely solid. Tamiyo, Tomato, Inquisitive Student. One of my favorite cards in Modern at the moment. I think it's really, really good. I think it's even better if you're playing a heavy cantrip version with like Considers, Preordain, maybe Cling to Dust. If you're not playing the heavy cantrips, it is a good turn 1 play. Doesn't really do a whole lot to help you either A, close out the game, or B, find interaction in the first couple turns, just because paying 2 to crack a clue is very expensive. In these reactive style shells, the instant speed shells, it's really nice to have a Tamiyo down on 1, generate some clues, hold up counterspell, and if your opponent doesn't do anything, draw a card. Unfortunately, kind of like Archmage's Charm, Sauron's Ransom, stock up. The format is a little too fast and a little too explosive to really allow you to consistently crack clues. So at that point, Tamiyo just becomes like a 1 mana 0/3 flyer, and that's it. So as much as I love Tamiyo, decent chance she's not going to be making the trip to Charlotte with me, but we'll see. We still got a day to finalize here and there. Brazen Borrower, I think, is awful. I do not like bounce effects in Modern at the moment. Sink into Stupor only gets a pass because it can be a land and it can be an unsubstantiate on the stack. Brazen Borrower into the Flood Maw being actual like bounce a permanent that's already resolved in a format where everything's got ETB abilities or everything does something when it enters tree or something else. I just do not think is worth it. If we were in a format where like Murktide, opposing Murktides were the thing you were concerned about, then I'd be all on board with Brazen Borrower into the Flood Maw. But that's just not the meta that we're currently in. So I do not want to be bouncing an Imri or a Solitude, an Overlord, a Ranger Captain, a Spyro, Primeval Titan, any of that sort of stuff. And the non-creature stuff that you could potentially bounce, I think if you're spending your turn bouncing a static prison that dropped your Murktide from an 8/8 to a 3/3, not hugely worth it. Or bouncing a Goblin Bombardment when they can just replay it the next turn. Maybe you have the interaction the next turn, but it's just not really been the way games have played out for me, so I'm not highly interested in playing a bounce effect. Overlord, I played like one league with Overlord and just found that my threat density was too low. I was never getting anything back. So playing out the Overlord on 2 and getting to actually start attacking with it on like turn 7 is just too much in between for a card that might not do anything in the meantime. If you were on like Esper and running Subtlety, Solitude, whatnot, it gets more use, but just in the straight Dimir shell, not really it. Dolphy Voidwalker, another one of the cards that get comments about constantly. I think in the current reactive blue shell, I would not touch Dolphy, and it's because the mana base is too inconsistent to support it on turn 2. You've got your 2 islands, 3 sink into Stupor, 2 or 3 sink. So that's 4 or 5 non-black producing lands. Decent chance you're going to have one of those in your opener and not be able to play out your Dolphy on 2. If you shift the mana base to allow Dolphy, so maybe you run Fell the Profane or Boggart Trawler as one of your MDFCs to help the double black, you just become like a worse counterspell, worse subtlety, worse force negation deck. And I think Counterspell Force especially are your strongest cards or some of your strongest cards. It's not worth making those worth or worse to try to force Dolphy into the deck. So I'm not on Dolphy. I wouldn't recommend Dolphy, but if you're already wanting to go heavy black, then Dolphy could be a good option for you, but I'm more interested in being heavy blue. Sideboard. We're going to run down the list of sideboard options that I have found effective, not effective, some popular options, reasonings here and there. Talk about what matchups they're useful for. And yeah, so Harbinger of the Seas, our premier land interruption spell. Lights out against Amulet. Very, very good against Eldrazi, cutting off the double colorless. Zoo, if you can get a Leyline of the Guild Pact off the battlefield with like Sink into Stupor, then Harbinger can sometimes lock out Zoo. It's good into opposing Esper Ketramos builds. They usually don't have the mana to play around it. There's plenty of matchups on the play where you can bring in Harbinger and kind of sneak away with a win. Stuff like Brood Scale combo, Mardu or Jeskai Energy, Creativity, which I doubt you see, but also comes in against any sort of Saga decks. So good bit of versatility there. I'm not a big fan of playing Harbinger in the main for 2 reasons. One, in an open deck list event, your opponent knowing about Harbinger means they can afford to play around it. And there's a lot of decks in Modern currently that you're not, them playing around it isn't affecting their mana in a substantial way as to disrupt their game plan. So decks like Grinding Station, if they just have Mox Opal, they can play around it to an extent. Decks like Boros can get their basics really easily. Eldrazi can get their basics very easily. Not that basic green is necessarily going to do a world of good, but like Orzhov can get basics aggressively. Domain can get basics. Stuff like that. The decks that want to play around it can play around it. The decks that like you really want Harbinger against, the Eldrazi's and Amulets, can't really, Amulet especially, can't really play around it. So if they know about it in the sideboard, there's really nothing they can do. But it saves you that main deck slot by not being a card that your opponent can play around it when you have games at 2 and 3 to bring it in when they can't play around it. If that makes any sense. All I mean is like the decks that can't play around it, you can bring it in games 2 and 3. They can't do anything about it, or not a lot they can do. The decks that can play around it game 1 will, and you're not picking up like any percentage points if you draw a Harbinger and your opponent's played around it. So I'd rather have them in the sideboard to bring in than have them in the main deck to potentially take out. Unless I walk into the room and it's just like 95% grinding station, because I do think Harbinger is a card that's good enough against grinding station that I don't think they can play around it as long as you do a good job of interacting with Mox Opal. If you interact with Mox Opal, a lot of times against grinding station, you can cut them down to just blue mana, which shuts off Underworld Breach, Malevolent Rumble, Flame of Anor, Sagas, Urza Sagas. I'm sure I'm forgetting more, but really good amount of stuff is just like rendered useless under a Harbinger. Spreading Seas, mostly for any Saga deck. So Breach, Amulet, Eldrazi sometimes. Well, Eldrazi I'm bringing it in anyway, but sometimes because of Saga. Anything that's got Saga, Spreading Seas, being able to strip mine a Saga on turn 2, draw a card, means that you're able to stop them before they're able to make that first construct token, which is really nice. It's kind of an in addition to Harbinger thing, not an in replacement of Harbinger, since the mana is not really able to support double black for Break the Ice on turn 2, just like Dauthi. Spreading Seas gives you an option to fight over things that way. It's also really cool to be able to hit a basic force against Eldrazi and take out a Utopia Sprawl. Mystical Dispute. Good on the play against Breach, and that's kind of it. It's good in the mirror, but we're not seeing a lot of mirror matches at the moment. So probably not running Mystical Dispute. It's kind of decent into like the other category on the win percentage metrics, but that's not really what I'm prepped for, which I'll talk about some prepping later, like what I'm looking for. Consigned to Memory, unfortunately, auto 4 of. I think that Eldrazi's popular enough that you kind of have to have Consigned to win that matchup. But the fact that it also comes in against Amulets and Zoo and a couple against Storm, couple against Orzhov, it's versatile enough to warrant the 4 of inclusion. Kaito, Bane of Nightmares. This card is basically in the board explicitly for black-white. They have next to no ways of getting it off the battlefield if it resolves. So bring out a black-white list here. Fortunately, this is an Aether Vial list. Yeah. But like Solitude can't hit it. Skyclave Apparition can, but most of the black-white lists we're seeing now aren't on Skyclave or Aether Vial. They can flicker it, but it comes back. They can Failure Attack and exile it, but it comes back. Can't Fatal Push it. Can't Wrath the Skies it can't Wrath the Skies it, period. Can't March of Otherworldly Light it. Yeah, just dodges like everything under the sun, which is a really big deal. But what we're seeing more is black-white leaning more towards like the Relic Ketramose stuff and even fewer ways of dealing with it. So they have a tougher time attacking into Kaito. We're just able to keep ticking down or zeroing, like stunning Ketramose, zeroing, ticking up to speed up the clock, whatever. Just very, very resilient, very, very avoidant of all sorts of interaction. I would also bring Kaito in matchups where your opponent is overly prepared with Grave Hate. So if you've got to board out some number of Murktides because of a bunch of relics or Soul Guide Lanterns or whatever, Kaito can be a good board in those matchups. Or any matchup where spot removal is heavily, heavily present. So think like your old school Jund mid-range matches where terminates, fatal pushes, all that stuff is flying everywhere. Kaito's really good into those for being able to dodge a lot of that creature removal. Nihil Spellbomb, Ghost Vacuum, Leyline, Surgical, all of our Grave Hate options. Spellbomb, I think, is the best as a fair piece of Grave Hate.
I do not think that Grave Hate is an effective answer into the Breach deck. A lot of times you need to hit the graveyard once just to stop like Unholy Heat with Delirium or Shifting Woodlands, but it's not an effective stop to the combo. If you want to more effectively stop the combo with Grave Hate, like Leyline of the Void, Dolthy are your best options. Dolthy, I've already said, it's kind of unplayable. Leyline, I don't like the variability of having to mold to it or risk drawing a completely dead piece of cardboard. So as far as grinding station goes, the Grave Hate kind of sucks, but Spellbomb against decks like Boros, really good. I like bringing in a single copy against Amulet or Eldrazi to fight over Emrakul the Promised End, to fight over Lumra or what's the other one? Aftermath Analyst, Shenanigans, Yawgmoth, it's a good one to bring in. Obviously, opposing Murktide decks. Anything with Flage, I'm bringing in one or two. Ghost Vacuum, really good if you're on Ketchermos, but if you're not on Ketchermos, I would just stick with Nihil Spellbomb. Just being able to hit the entire yard instead of one card a turn is a big deal. I get wanting to use Ghost Vacuum as like a late game win con, but I think most of the decks that you want to have Grave Hate against, the late game doesn't matter. You need the Grave Hate early and you need it to be comprehensive. Surgical Extraction, I think, is really good if you're expecting exactly like Grinding Station Amulet. Being able to stop combo against Grinding Station is big. Your priority, though, is like if you can hit Underworld Breach, hit Underworld Breach. If you can't hit Breach, good luck. Had a game yesterday where opponent had an Emery getting back a Mishra's Bauble. I had a Harbinger out and I was going to surgical the Mishra's Bauble, and I knew they had a Mox Opal in the yard. I wanted to hit Mox Opal so that Emery could potentially lock them out, but I couldn't afford to have them draw 2 cards a turn. Surgical the Mishra's Bauble. They had a Mox Opal in hand and comboed through the Emery, through the misused surgical. So if you're going to have surgical, I'm not against it, but be very, very deliberate with your surgical targets. Do not fire them off just for like value on something. You have to say, all right, my problem is explicitly this. I'm surgicaling explicitly this. I'm not wary. I'm not like, what's the word for it? Mind wandering off and surgicaling something else that isn't my game plan. But a good interaction to have in your back pocket is late game when surgical on an Underworld Breach is really important, and you want to play around your opponent having multiple Underworld Breaches in hand, and you've got surgical, counterspell, whatever. Find an opportunity or try to find an opportunity to create something on the stack. So if your opponent casts an Underworld Breach, you've got a counterspell, you've got a surgical, see if there's something you can put on the stack, whether it be crack a fetch land, discard to a frog, fly a frog, pass some removal spell on something. Just create a stack moment. Use your counterspell on the Underworld Breach. When that resolves and your thing you put on the stack, so like Underworld Breach, put something on the stack, counterspell on the Underworld Breach, counterspell resolves with your thing still on the stack, surgical the Underworld Breach. That way your opponent doesn't get priority back and can't just go put another breach on the stack. It happens a lot of times your opponent, like after a long grinding game, has got 2 Underworld Breaches in hand and can fight through that first piece of counter magic. So if the opportunity arises, put something on the stack. Dress Down, I got dressed down on the main and dressed down on the side. I don't mind it out of the side. I think it's a little bit better out of the side than out of the main, but that's more because I want it almost explicitly against constructs and not much else. It's okay into solitudes. It's okay into Boros, okay into Amulet, but like you still have to deal with against Amulet killing the Titan or killing them. Against Boros, you still have to deal with killing the Ranger Captain or killing the Flage or whatever. So usually I'm not a big fan of effects that you still have to answer the problem. They just kind of delay it. Here I am registering subtlety. Anoint with Affliction is kind of the sideboard go-to against Ketramos. But I think if you're running 4 Counterspell, 3-4 Subtlety, the 3-4 Bowmasters, you're not as concerned about Ketramos as a lot of people are. So I wouldn't feel like this is a necessary inclusion. Oh, and the Dismembers. Wouldn't feel like Anoint's a necessary inclusion, but if you just want an extra answer to specifically Ketramos, it's good. Can also exile Frog or Oculus, but again, those matchups aren't as popular, so take it with a grain of salt. Your Wrath effects, Toxic Deluge, Glistening Deluge, EE. Toxic Deluge, I think, is the best because if I want a Wrath effect, I want it to take out everything. Glistening Deluge runs into the issue of if your opponent's got a Guide of Souls and they get counters on it, it no longer kills that Guide of Souls, which is a big deal. Same thing if they like fly in a Johnny. So you don't want your Wrath effect to not hit everything. The not paying life is nice, but the double black means that if you do run into some random Boros opponents that are still running Blood Moon in some number, you could get Blood Mooned off of Glistening Deluge, but you shouldn't get Blood Mooned off Toxic Deluge if you fetch your basics. EE takes out 9 times out of 10 the 1-drops, being able to hit Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride, Ragavan, Static Prison, but you'll have plenty of games where you take out the 2s just to take out like a Goblin Bombardment, Flip to Johnny, something like that. But I would more incline you to take out the 1s because that's how they go wide, or wide and tall with like Ocelot Pride, Guide of Souls, and Static Prison to potentially get back a Frog or a Murktide, whatever, while you make that Wrath effect is very, very nice. The problem I've got with Wrath effects at the moment is Deluge and Toxic Deluge, Glistening Deluge, I think are good against Boros, exactly Boros, and literally nothing else. And I've been winning that matchup a decent bit without either of those Wrath effects. So if they're there for one matchup and I don't feel like I really need that matchup to win, or that card to win that matchup, then I'd rather just save those sideboard slots for something else. EE has a little versatility against Saga tokens, against Breach. So if you think that you need to have that EE in for the Breach matchup, you can absolutely do that. If you've determined that EE is a good card against Breach, I would run like 2 of them instead of just 1. Because I do think that cleaning up Saga tokens is a really big thing to have access to post-board. But I wouldn't go into the matchup thinking that's enough to win it. It's just a tool in your arsenal. The Torpor Orb, finally, 99% for black-white. However, the current black-white lists going farther away from like the Aether Vial shenanigans means that Torpor Orb stock is dropping pretty aggressively. Something like this, where Emperor of Bones doesn't care about ETB, Felia kind of, Flickerwisp does, Ketramos doesn't, Overlord doesn't, Solitude kind of. Like, them just sticking a 3-2 lifelinker is still a pretty tough thing to deal with sometimes. And then the inclusion of cards like Prismatic Ending definitely makes Torpor Orb worse. It's kind of like Leyline of the Void, where if you got Torpor Orb and you slam an orb on turn 2, you still have to have a very functional hand, because you risk your opponent attacking him with Belia, blinking out the Torpor Orb, then getting to resolve something second main phase. So just be careful of that Torpor Orb is not an I win card against black-white by any stretch of the imagination. So that's the breakdown on all the cards. I've tested what I think about all of them. Let's get into what I'm expecting the Charlotte meta to look like. All right, what am I gearing for, expecting to see going into RC Charlotte? So this is matchup data between February 15th and March 5th. I think mostly from challenges, but a little bit all over the place. Obviously not a perfect representation of anything, but just some general trends that I've kind of noticed or that the data suggests. We've seen a bit of a separation here between Grinding Station and the Orzhov deck. It used to be like neck and neck win percentages. This has got Grinding Station pulling ahead a little bit, Orzhov falling back a bit. And I think that is going to be prevalent on people's minds. I think Grinding Station is like the tier 0 deck in Modern. Everything needs to be focused towards, where it used to be like 1A, 1B with Grinding Station and Orzhov. So I expect a good bit of Grinding Station. Wouldn't be surprised if it tops 20% of the meta in Charlotte. Could be 25%. But need to have a solid game plan against Grinding Station. Orzhov, I think, will be very well represented, probably in like the 15 to 20% range, or some sort of black-white X Ketramos deck, whether it be Necro Dominance or black-white Blink with Aether Vial, black-white Blink with Relic of Progenitus, the Esper with Psychic Frog, some form of black-white X Ketramos. Boros will still be very popular. It's probably going to be like close to 15%, just like Orzhov. So Grinding Station, Orzhov, Boros, I think, are the three I would heavily key in on and try to have a very solid, repeatable game plan for. Eldrazi has definitely dropped in win percentage a good bit recently. I think that comes hand in hand with the rise in Breach. Just like we can see on the data here, not a very good matchup into Breach, so not too much of a surprise there. Amulet Titan did win RC Portland, so I wouldn't be shocked to see Titan show up a decent amount. They do have a positive win rate into Boros, 50-50 into Grinding Station and Orzhov, so player skill is expressed a good bit in those Amulet matchups. And if there's any group of people that are convinced of their own player skill, Amulet Titan is definitely that player base. So we're going to have a lot of confident Amulet Titan opponents. We'll see if they can show off. Esper and Dimir, the Frog decks, Frog Murktide, Oculus decks. I think Esper is still going to be the more popular option. People have grown attached to their pest controls for whatever reason. We got more Ketramos brewers in the house really trying out. So I think there'll be more Esper than Dimir. But I do think that Dimir will probably do better. I do see the win percentages on here, and a lot of matchups are leaning towards Esper. But I think Dimir has got a little bit more of the momentum. I think the flash builds especially are playing pretty good into Blink, into Boros, Ramp, Amulet. And they are beating up on the mirror a pretty good bit. So my money's on Dimir between the Dimir Esper showdown, but we'll see. And then Ruby Storm and Domain, I think, are both kind of sleepers. The percentage points against Breach are rough, but both of those decks are pretty good at having sideboard options to prepare for Breach. Ruby Storm can play Orm's Chant to really help out the matchup. Domain can sideboard into any number of answers, being a 5-color deck potentially. So if they want to bring in more artifact enchantment hate, they can. Counterspells, they can. If they want to bring in Orm's Chant, they can. So I think both those decks are very, very flexible in their ability to adjust to any particular meta. And I think Storm Hate is at a bit of a low. Like, people are still playing a lot of artifact enchantment and grave hate against Grinding Station. Not a lot of ways to deal with like the combo once the combo is resolved. So not a lot of Orm's Chants. I could see Storm having a pretty good weekend. But for me, Grinding Station, Orzhov, Black White X, Ketramos, Boros Energy are the three things that I am trying my best to focus in on. I'm accepting that I've naturally got a decent win rate against Amulet Titan, Eldrazi, the Black White Blue Esper Ketramos build with Frog and whatnot. So I think Dimir will be okay in those. But it's all going to be about sideboard choices and game plan decisions against Breach, Orzhov, and Boros. I think recently we've had really good win rates against Boros and Orzhov, especially Orzhov not being on Vile. Grinding Station has been hit or miss from week to week. Some weeks it's 5-0, some weeks it's 2-3. So consistency is going to play a big part. We'll see how that plays out in the long run. But that's my expected meta for Charlotte. Grinding Station number 1, Orzhov, Boros, kind of tied for number 2. And then decent representation from Amulet, Storm, and Zoo being a little bit of a sleeper pick. So a few very simple parting words. I think we are in a modern format where it is important now more than ever to have a game plan for whatever you think you're going to run into. Your game plan doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to have a set of goals for every individual matchup. If you're looking for some outside assistance between now and Saturday, feel free to reach out to me on Discord. I got a link to the Discord down below. More than welcome to come join the conversation. Love to have you. If you want to see gameplay of a lot of these top matchups, I've got challenges. We've played in 4 challenges recently and top 8'd all 4 of them. This is like leading up to as recent as yesterday. We've got recent gameplay up, showing a lot of good matchups, hopefully some amount of good gameplay. So everything's time stamped in the video description. If you want to find a specific matchup, you can go there, look for it. I've got matchup breakdowns against stuff like Underworld Breach, against Black White Blink, against Amulet Titan, some of the high against Boros, some of the really crucial matchups. Got breakdowns of those on YouTube. Feel free to go give them a watch if you're looking for some extra insight. But coming up with a game plan, I think, has led to so many wins. Just saying, I'm not going to get distracted by all these flashy lights over here that are going on. I'm focusing in on this. This is my goal for this matchup. So having that type of focus, I think, has done a phenomenal job for helping my win rate recently. I think it'll help you as well. Again, if you want help on coming up with what that needs to look like, come join the Discord. Best place to open up to all these discussions. Other than that, hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your evening. Thank you so much for watching. Greatly appreciate it. Big shout out to everybody in the Discord, on the Twitch chat that's come in and given comments, suggestions. giving their 2 cents. Really helped make this prep process for RC Charlotte the best that it could be. So looking forward to hopefully reaping the fruits of some of these labors and putting up a good result. So if you're going to be in Charlotte, come say hey. Love to talk to you. Always enjoy talking to everybody. And we'll keep you updated as the weekend goes on. So go have a fantastic rest of your afternoon. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.